My friends, did Talon marry a Goron or a Gerudo or both? Has anyone ever caught the Hyrule Loach with the Fisherman's hat? Today we have some rare facts, theories, obscure lore, and unusual ponderings from the classic 1998 video game, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. And yes, I pronounced it Ocarina instead of Ocarina that time, just for those who prefer it. We'll see how long that lasts. So from the actual world record in the Running Man race, to the veracity of this Zora's claim in-game and this classic 4chan meme, get cozy, pour yourself a warm beverage, and let's dive into these obscure Zelda facts.
Here we go!
Okay, here's a theory I love, and I'm going to expound upon it in a way I've never seen online. There's the main theory, and there's this weird extension of the theory where could Talon have been married to a Goron at some point? I know it sounds insane, but let me explain. First, we'll go over this one. Is Malon half-Gerudo? This one comes from an interesting video called A Strange Implication, uploaded by Circuit a few years ago. If you complete the mask trading sequence, you can wear the full set of masks around Hyrule and get some interesting interactions. One of these includes wearing the Gerudo mask and talking to Talon, who will tell you that the mask reminds him of his wife. On second thought, it doesn't. It doesn't look like her at all. This gets even more interesting if you wear the Gerudo mask and speak with Nabooru in the Spirit Temple as Child Link. Now you can only speak with her before completing the temple, but after you've unlocked it, so this really depends on having certain flags saved in your file or not. But if you can do it, she will say this: "That's odd, it kind of looks like me. No, not really, not at all if you look at it closely." So fair enough, what exactly caused them to respond this way? They both think at first that there's a passing resemblance, and then no, not really. Like, that can't be a coincidence, right? Could it be that Talon and Nabooru were once married? Some have suggested that the later denial in their text box of any resemblance in the second half debunks this theory. But I actually think it strengthens it, because they seemed caught off guard at first, and only when looking closely does the mask resemble someone other than the person they once knew intimately, whether it be Talon's wife or Nabooru herself. Now, the notion that these two were once married and may even had Malon as their daughter together is further implied by two gossip stones located outside the Temple of Time. One of them reads, "They say that Gerudos sometimes come to Hyrule Castle to look for boyfriends." Of course, we know that Talon goes back and forth from Hyrule Castle to deliver milk, so could he have crossed paths with a Gerudo, possibly Nabooru, on one of these trips? Another gossip stone reads, "They say that Malon's at the original record in the obstacle course of Goron Wrench, implying that Malon is proficient with horses and riding." Do you know who else are proficient with horses, riding, and archery and the likes? The Gerudo. Honestly, this is all the evidence I personally need to stand this theory to ship Talon and Nabooru, even if they are no longer married. Actually, on second thought, Talon only responds to the mask by saying his wife in the present tense. So could Talon and Nabooru still be married? Another extra tidbit in this line of thinking is the notion that in Breath of the Wild, we do indeed see a pretty gruff, homely, blue-collared Hylian guy, Hudson, get married to a Gerudo and make a life for themselves in Tarrytown. The idea of Hylian Gerudo relationships, especially when it comes to male Hylian, female Gerudo, seem pretty common in Zelda lore. Like I said, I fully believe this theory. Talon and Nabooru are or were married, but here's the extra wrench in it that you've probably never heard before. If you wear the Zora mask and speak to Talon or Nabooru, you'll get pretty typical unremarkable dialogue. And if you wear the Goron mask and speak to Nabooru, you get that same dialogue. However, if you wear the Goron mask and speak with Talon, well, you get the same dialogue as if you wore the Gerudo mask. "Hey, that reminds me of my wife." On second thought, it doesn't. Again, some have used this to suggest that this text is sort of meaningless or whatever, but in my opinion, it presents yet an even more insane theory. Could Talon have previously not been married to only Nabooru, or even still married to her, but in addition to this, he was at some point married to a Goron? Now, of course, this sounds ridiculous, but we do know that relationships across the different races of Zelda lore do exist. So could such a thing be possible? Could Talon have, married a Goron as his first wife, then divorced, remarried with Nabooru, fathered Malon with Nabooru, and who knows, could even have a half-Goron child out there with a Goron wife and a Goron mother from a previous relationship? Well, that's a lot less convincing, there's a lot less evidence for it, but it really makes you wonder. Either way, I truly believe that Talon and Nabooru were once married, if not still married, and that Malon is their offspring, making her half Hylian, half Gerudo. Alright, this is another thing I've wanted to see for a very long time. I even made a community post about it a while ago, but let's ponder again. In the fishing pond, it's pretty well known that, as adult Link, you can steal the hat of the fishing pond owner by casting your rod towards him at just the right angle. He gets mad, understandably as he's going bald, but if you save, he never gets his hat back. So the game must actually store his hat removal as some kind of permanent flag in the game's memory. Anyway, let's say you get his hat, hooked to your fishing rod. You can then cast and go fishing with it. Now it only stays on the rod for a couple of casts before falling off and dissolving into the ether forever. Remember, it never goes back to the fishing pond owner's head, and importantly for this postulation, when the hat is on your hook, well, I thought it acted very similarly to the sinking lure. We'll get to that in a second. I assume you know about the sinking lure, by the way. Kind of a temporary object in the pond, which is kind of cheating, but helps catch fish deeper in the pond. My childhood cartridge has a saved record fish with the sinking lure, so it just gets denoted that you used the sinking lure rather than canceling out the record for cheating. But either way, you might see what I'm getting at. Another fish that the sinking lure makes it much easier to catch is the rare and near mythological Hyrule Loach. So here's my postulation. Can anyone out there get the fisherman's hat on their hook, and then in the small handful of casts you still get with the hat on the hook, use it to catch the Hyrule Loach? What would it look like, holding the Hyrule Loach with the hat on your hook? That's all I want to see. Is such a thing even possible? In a way, I'm kind of surprised no one has tried this, given the breadth of lore and insanity when it comes to this game. And the fishing sequence is an amazing part of this defining game, considered among the very greatest of all time. So that's my challenge, the Goose, Fisherman, Hat-Loach challenge. Are you a bad enough dude to catch the Hyrule Loach with the fisherman's hat on your hook? But now here's the thing. When I finally revisited this and got the hat on the hook, I realized that it doesn't actually act like the sinking lure at all. It just kind of is on the hook in the shallows, but once you cast it into the deeps of the pond, that's when the hat falls off and goes away. And now, while you can catch the Hylian Loach without the sinking lure, and so you could probably in theory catch it with casting just in the shallow-ish area, maybe it might still be possible to catch the Hylian Loach, or Hyrule Loach, with the fisherman's hat on your hook. But I'm not quite sure if the Hyrule Loach even surfaces outside of the area in which the hat would still stay on the hook at all in order to make this possible. So, is it possible? I don't know. This needs more investigation. Maybe some Ocarina of Time tool-assisted runner could look into this, because again, I want to get to the bottom of this mystery. If you manage to pull it off or have any more information, please notify me by email, Twitter, in the comments, any which way. Thank you, my friends. The Fisherman Hat-Loach Challenge. So here's something that's been causing me to ponder for really my whole life, but especially lately. In Ocarina of Time, I'm sure you know that Running Man minigame or contest, or whatever you want to call it. You know, as adult Link, you talk to the Running Man after the bridge over Gerudo Valley is repaired, and you race him to the Lost Woods. This is of course the same Running Man who you sell the bunny hat to as a child as part of the Mask's side quest. Now, any knowledgeable Oot lore knower will know that you cannot beat the Running Man. No matter what happens, he beats you by 1 second. This is true even if you use glitches to get a time of 0 seconds. And I suppose for many, that was that. You just thought, wow, you can't beat him? That's it. You can use various glitches to overclock the timer or get message pop-ups to delay the timer, but the Running Man is always there beating you by 1 second. Now perhaps this fact has disincentivized people from actually speedrunning this category, which is kind of odd to me since it just pops out so naturally as one of the things that should be speedrun in Ocarina of Time, a game with an immense speedrun history. It's one of the most natural single-level challenge speedruns in the game, and is more complex and interesting than, say, the Epona race in Goron Wrench or the Zora diving game. So what's the world record in this Running Man race? The in-game record-keeping chart in Link's house simply refers to this as the marathon, though it's certainly quite a bit shorter than a conventional marathon. But what's the record? For, say, a no timer manipulation category. Not quite glitchless, because I want to see a few of those, but, no overclocking the timer. I want to see the record played out with bomb slides and hyper-extended super slides and see people grind this category down to whatever might be possible. But for one reason or another, there's never been much competition this way, despite it feeling so natural from my perspective as out of a single-level speedrunner. When I played this back in the day, and I have no qualms in sharing that I spent probably a few dozen hours just grinding out Running Man attempts in the early 2000s. I would usually hop on Epona and ride out towards the forest, not knowing about extended super slides being faster back then, or about their existence at all. Nowadays, with a bit of research, I found two things. One, there's this tool-assisted speedrun by Umis14 of 42 seconds, which is pretty much exactly what I had in mind. It only has 600 views, and the description is, "Some Twitch nerds told me to make this, could probably be improved a little." So there it is. Pretty cool and remarkable stuff, and it's kind of shocking that I guess there's such little interest, or this is such a niche subcategory in what is overall one of the more popular and legendary speed games of all time. But what about a non-tool assisted speedrun? Well, I found this run from none other than Zelda legend ZFG. His description reads this: "I watched a casual player trying to beat the Running Man recently, not knowing that you can't beat him, and it made me want to see what time I could get with hessing, or hyper-extended super sliding. 48 should be possible, maybe 47 with a god run." And of course, CFG gets 49. Given this is pretty old, dating back to 2013, I wonder if it were ever revisited, if any new innovations or skills would help lower this to 47, or maybe even lower. I'd love to see some more competition in this ancient and legendary category, observe a grind down to 47 or 46, and also see this added as a category on speedrun.com in the levels section. What are your thoughts? Did you ever try to beat the Running Man? I certainly did, believing it to be one of many ways to possibly get the Triforce while playing back in the 90s and early 2000s. Imagine just beating this guy and him just handing you the Triforce for some reason. Well, we all pondered it back then. Alas, my friends, not even a time in the 40s of seconds will beat him, but I would still love to see as fast as it can go. My friends, this Zora tells us that all of Hyrule's water comes from Zora's fountain. And of course, there's this legendary meme that proclaims that all of Hyrule's water passes under King Zora's, seated position. But is this true? Today I wanted to put this to the test and put these theories to rest by following the water from Zora's fountain through Zora's domain and down Zora's river and seeing if really all of Hyrule's water does come from this source in the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So here we are in the one and only Zora's fountain, the proclaimed source of all water in Hyrule in Ocarina of Time. And as we explore the fountain, there's not really any obvious location where there's, a spring coming up here at the bottom of this pool of water. One can imagine that sort of is what is implied here. Even if we use iron boots and sink down to the bottom, it's not like we see an obvious, if you've ever seen a natural water spring, it's really quite something to witness, the water bubbling up, and you really feel the cold source of the water pulsating at you. Now, the game was made in 1998, it was a marvel for the time, still considered the greatest game ever to many, and so I can forgive them for not putting an exact source of the spring here in Zora's fountain. But it definitely seems like that is what they are sort of trying to imply with the idea that this area is the source for all of Hyrule's water. And it's not like there's some higher waterfall that comes down feeding the source of Zora's fountain. It truly comes from this, pool of water that then seems to be the source for everything else from here. And the first point that I think is important to realize is that the meme of all the water passing under King Zora's, regions is probably untrue, because we see water spilling in two directions here from Zora's fountain. One flows through this fence over some sort of cascading waterfall. You might be able to piece together exactly where this is falling, and the rest goes through here. Now let's go through here and see where the water that does indeed pass near Mr. King Zora, His Highness, ends up, and it sort of, cascades down here into this very shallow pool. I imagine it being nice and humid here, and then it falls down this massive waterfall into the, Zora's domain area, which, for all intents and purposes is pretty cool. Obviously, we know that warp below us heads to Lake Hylia. How exactly does the water transfer through there, if at all? Perhaps a mystery for later in this video, or maybe even another time. But there's the water cascading down here into Zora's domain, replenishing this beautiful pool area. But let's head outside of Zora's domain to Zora's river and keep following things from there. So here we are outside of Zora's domain, we're in Zora's river. If we look up, we can see water cascading down, and it very certainly seems to be as if this is intended to be that waterfall from the fountain down into the river. If you look closely at this map here, you can even kind of see that that is that waterfall. And so I think pretty quickly we can address the fact that not all of the water passes under King Zora, but right now it all is leaving the fountain, or at least it's leaving the fountain and feeding down here into Zora's river. And if I actually play the Zelda's Lullaby, the wonderful song, we'll get kind of a cutscene that gives us a bit of perspective here on the waterfall. It really looks up, there's a bit of opening there, but we get this perspective where it looks, you see it really coming from above us, and it must come from that area in Zora's fountain. But let's jump in and follow the river. We got a lot of little cascading pools, quite a raging, pulsating river, we'll say. You got to go with the flow. You can't really go against it. Coming down this river, it does fork in two sides here, but it really reminds me of the early any percent speedruns back in the mid-2000s. It was one of the common rupee routes to follow the river and even do a jump slash here for a red rupee. And that would help get your coins for the Kokiri Shield, was it? And so that's pretty cool. Quite a nostalgic ride down Zora's river. But of course, it ends, and we get to Zora's field. Hyrule Field, of course. Now, This, I remember, the guys doing crazy setups to do a WES, a water extended super slide to get to Kakariko Village. But let's see where the water runs from here out of Zora's river. Well, on one branch, it comes over into this infamous spot. This is a spot featured prominently in one of the early Unusual Places videos by Annie Austin. It just kind of pools in this region. It's almost, made for no reason other than to look cool. I think you get a big ferry from here, and that's cool, but the water certainly ends there. No more water continues. So we must simply follow it down this way. And let's go take a look where it goes. And here we are. What a beautiful stroll in the wonderful Hyrule field, other than the strange Stalfos. We'll jump off this ledge, and we'll see the river continues. And my friends, indeed, it is indeed continuing under the arch towards the beautiful Hyrule Castle Town, as it's called. And even the villagers here, the Hyruleans, seem to have been able to engineer their construction in such a way to use the river as a kind of moat, which is pretty advanced, Quite a lot of intellect went into it, especially for this era. And, it's really supposed to be some kind of medieval town. So it's pretty cool to see them use it that way as a protection from town. Will it hold up against all enemies of the castle? Maybe or maybe not. Now we see the river follow down here into the sort of castle area, and where does it continue from there? Well, my friends, it continues around this large wall into this sort of back end area. Now we don't see it for sure, but it certainly seems that way. So if we run all the way around and down, my friends, indeed, look at this. We got this. This is always a cool area. Like, you'd hang out here and be like, there's got to be more secrets and stuff. There's a few grottos and whatnot. But it certainly always intrigued me playing the game. And we see, surely the game is intending that water to continue and carry down here this way. Now, what does it do while it's in there? I don't really know. I don't know if there is a good explanation for it. If I pause here, it's to our right, it's to our east. We're really still on the outskirts of Castletown and the market. We're not really in the main castle area, I would say. And that may be important for later. So this edge of the river, it's not super deep here. I think you can just dive down and you get to the bottom pretty quick. Not even a full breath of dive. And we get to this grate. Well, where does it go from this grate? And unfortunately, the answer is not very clear from there. But I have an idea of where it might be. Well, here we're in Gerudo Valley. We see our little spillage of water coming through the rock here. But the main next source of water, or perhaps continuation of the water in Hyrule, is this massive, massive waterfall. And so could and should that drain that we saw outside of Castletown carry on behind the scenes and end up right here in this rampaging massive waterfall here in Gerudo Valley? And we know it carries on quite significantly. And I'm going to jump in a second. Despite that it says no diving allowed, let's see if it won't do you any good. Let's see if that's true. And we know if we think about, deeper into Gerudo Valley, is there really any water in there? It's the haunted wasteland, the desert. So not really. But if we follow this water, and that's a heck of a dive. That's way higher than even the, Olympic divers do 10 meters, and there's even other swimming and diving competitions where they do high diving at like 22, maybe up to 37-ish meters, if I believe is correct. And they land on their feet in those dives, and that looks way higher than that. But it takes us to none other than Lake Hylia, and as we continue cascading down, here we are in the beautiful, full, replenished, clear water of Lake Hylia. Perhaps the Zelda's version of the Great Lakes, or one of the Great Lakes, And certainly this lake is very full and wonderful. And it seems to be true that the source of this water was indeed Zora's fountain. Now, if I come down here and we just dive down here and check that opening, how does the water go back and forth? We're certainly at a lower elevation than we were in Zora's domain. And, there's obviously a little bit of game magic going on. We can tell even the fishing pond, probably it's a bit of a decline to get in there. So probably the water there makes sense. And yeah, could it be true that all of Hyrule's water comes from Zora's fountain? Well, I can think of a couple small exceptions. So let's take a look at them and see if and how they fit into this in-game lore. So one of the exceptions is obviously right off the bat here in Kokiri Forest. We see this little, small waterfall come and sort of be the source of the forest's water. Some of the first water you interact with in game, and there's just kind of little pooling, and it's very comfy and, not too scary as you're just learning how to interact with your environment in this game. And presumably even, there's no water over by the Great Deku Tree, although there is some in the tree itself. Presumably this sort of forms a pond and maybe some groundwater here in the forest. Now, if you pause and look at the map again, you can really see that, Kokiri Forest and Lost Woods, it's not too far from Zora's domain and thus Zora's fountain. And so, when I think of the Deku Tree and other dungeons, you can sort of imagine that these dungeons exist in sort of a magical area where the rules of the world might not apply. And that's what could explain water in the various dungeons and temples. But certainly here, you could see the water, some sort of, river or offshoot flowing into Kokiri Forest from Zora's domain. It doesn't seem that far off, especially based on what we know on the map. And if I follow the Lost Woods into the, warp towards the one and only Zora's River, we do get this massive pool of water. And, clearly there's some sort of magic going on here at these warp points, just like the one between the domain and Lake Hylia. What's the connection? Where's the connection? Obviously, when we pause and we look at the map, it's not quite an exact fit as to the direct path between the Lost Woods there and the river. Well, maybe it is. If you look really close, maybe it is a pretty direct path. Now, there's another path that takes us right into Goron City, which makes less direct sense. And so I think it is fair to say there's something going on here, some sort of magical element. But in terms of we've established that Zora's fountain spills over here, this pool is full, and so the sort of, magical transition zone can indeed be what explains, I believe, the water in Kokiri Forest. I think that seems pretty reasonable. Now, another bit of recurring water is in the grottos, and this is throughout anywhere in Hyrule. There's two puddles with a fish in them, usually. I think that can be explained through groundwater rain. There's parts of the game where it rains. You play the Song of Storms, causing it to rain, and just the groundwater can flow through, and you get these pools in the grottos. The same goes for the fairies' fountains and even the Great Fairies' fountains. And this is true even in locations like Death Mountain and the Desert Colossus. There are pools of water, but they're depicted in these sort of underground scenarios. And so you can kind of buy them as being groundwater, rainwater absorbing through the ground in the game. But there is one place with some water that just doesn't quite add up to being from Zora's fountain. And I'll wonder if you can think of it as I'm about to pull the ocarina and warp there. So we can very clearly check out that Hyrule Castle is up on a hill, right? It is at higher elevation than we are currently, and the elevation we're at in the market is roughly equal to Hyrule Field, where we've seen that river follow and meander, and it makes sense. It's clearly a source from Zora's fountain. But if we go up into Hyrule Castle, and some of you may know what we're getting at, or may have clicked in what we're getting at. This mysterious, possibly non-fountain water. Well, it is perhaps unexplained to this day. Where did this water come from? Indeed, I am talking about none other than this moat at Hyrule Castle. Where does this water come from? How does it happen? How does it work? What sense does it make? And really, I can't quite figure it out. This water, when you play through the game for the first time, you splash about in the water all the time because you're setting up these crates and you're missing the jump, and it's pretty funny. And then, even you go into the castle, the guards are there, you get caught. There's even a little pool inside the castle. And look, there's water coming from here as well. Where does that water come from, Let's get ourselves caught here and removed. And I've always tried to piece together the castle, the exact architecture and geography of it never quite made sense. But, you get kicked out. And, where is this water from? We're clearly at a higher elevation in the field. And if I pause, it's not like we're really in an area where the meandering river makes sense to connect with us. And even I thought when we were examining at the field there, when we lose sight of the water briefly and it reappears in that sort of straight line shot at the far end of the field, could that be where we are in the castle? But I would say clearly not, because the castle on the map is depicted well deeper past the market and at a higher elevation. And so while I would say most of the water in the game is true and can be explained as coming from Zora's fountain, the moat around Hyrule Castle does not add up. One could maybe entertain a case where, could the castle guards be sent to, take buckets of water from somewhere and fill a moat that's sort of going round and round somehow? Is there a reservoir that's unseen and unspoken? Maybe. But there's a lot of explanations we can come up with that don't really mesh with what we know in game. And truly, the source of this moat water is, I would say, the mystery of the water when it comes to the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time.